This video is sponsored by me and you. Find out more at the end. What I'm about to share is very personal and private. Well, not so private anymore once I share the video, but it's the kind of thing that's usually kept private. I'm taking my chances anyway because I have a feeling that many of you out there can relate. Whether you currently believe or not, whether it's Islam or some other religion, there's some commonality to our experiences, and I hope that we can find it together. I'd like to be clear about the subtext of this video so it's not misunderstood. This is not a list of reasons why Islam is false or why I left Islam. If anything, a lot of what I'm about to mention is what kept me in Islam for way longer than I should have stayed. This is also not an assertion that every Muslim has had these experiences, but I bet that many had similar thoughts and never uttered a word about them. This is a cautionary tale about what could happen when critical thinking clashes with religion, in the mind of a Muslim child or teenager or even a fully grown adult for that matter. And since this video pertains to my life, let me start by giving you some background information, starting with my upbringing. I was a very curious kid. I asked a lot of why questions at home and in school. I used to dismantle my toys to see what's on the inside, and I didn't always put them back together in working order. But that was okay, because I grew up in a household where curiosity and learning were highly valued, so I didn't shy away from experimenting. I was also encouraged to read, and so I did. In the beginning, it was mostly fiction, but I found myself reading ahead of the class in my textbooks, so my parents got me non-fiction books about the topics that I was interested in. And I really loved to read. So much so that I would sneak a book into bed every night and try to read in the dark. But my mother thought that it could damage my eyes, so she installed a lamp above my bed. That way I could get in a few more pages around bedtime. Clearly, there was no discouragement from my family when it came to learning. Simultaneously, my parents emphasized the importance of learning about Islam. I wasn't getting much of a religious education in school, even though I lived in Saudi Arabia, because my school didn't teach the country's curriculum. We did have an Islamic class that was just named religion, but it was only Islam. However, my parents probably knew that the class wasn't taken very seriously, and they were right. We barely learned anything. They could have sent me to religious classes at the mosque after school, but they feared I'd be influenced by a more fundamentalist version of Islam. So they hired a sheikh to come over every week and teach me Islam with a focus on reading and memorizing the Quran. At the same time, my parents told me stories of the prophets, Sirat al-Anbiya, and the Prophet Muhammad's stories, the Sirat Nabawiyya. We would watch religious talk shows and lectures on TV. We would go to Umrah at least once a year. The point is that Islam had been an undisputed fact in my life since I first gained consciousness. That meant that from the earliest stages of my life, my curiosity about how the world works was met with both Islamic and scientific answers. And at first, Islam fed into that sense of wonder. I had a lot to discover about the mysterious metaphysical world, and I was excited about it. But the more I learned, the more distressed and confused I became. And that's the first way Islam hurt my mental health. It stifled my curiosity. I learned that in Islam, when I ask why questions, the answers were often so unsatisfactory that they amplified my confusion. For example, I was confused about why fairy tales about magic kingdoms and flying witches were all fiction and fantasy, but the Islamic tales of talking animals and demonic spirits were real. Why can't I see supernatural events today? I was told that most of these reality-shattering miracles didn't happen anymore. Why? Because they ended with the prophets. Why? Because it would be too easy to believe if we saw them, so Allah is testing our faith. But why? Why rely on word of mouth and gullibility when we could have some semblance of evidence? Because that's how Allah knows best. That's how He wants it. We are too simple-minded to ever understand His wisdom. Most unanswerable questions in Islam are eventually met with because Allah said so. And ironically, Muslim apologists claim that Islam encourages curiosity and learning because Allah said Iqra, meaning read. Yet, no matter how receptive to questions and learning a religious preacher is, they often provide answers that rely on faith, not knowledge. And what good is reading if the more I do of it, the more confused I am and the less faith I have? My critical thinking seemed to always lead me to more confusion and eventually to dead ends, because Allah knows best. Well, I tried my best to explain every plot hole with that answer, which seldom worked. And I don't know what came first, my obsessive nature or my curiosity about Islam, but it was a bad combination. I could not stop thinking about Islam. And can you blame me? 5 times a day the world grinds to a halt for prayer. Mosques blared the adhan, shops closed down, people congregated, and we prayed before resuming our day. I was also taught to repeat Islamic prayers and phrases in my free time to gain good deeds, not to mention reading and memorizing the Quran every day. Lots and lots of reminders of Islam, all of which reminded me of the consequences of existence, torture, Allah's wrath, eternal hell, The Quran is full of this stuff. So how could my mind rest before figuring out how to avoid such a fate? How can I pretend I don't notice that Islam seems so otherworldly and nonsensical? I learned from experience that curiosity and the need to understand brought me suffering. The more I learned about Islam, the more terrified I was of the consequences, and the less able I was to think about anything else. How could I pursue my curiosity about this temporary world when I'm riddled with terror of the afterlife? Who cares how cars are made when I still don't understand how God can be both merciful and tyrannical? It felt like thinking about anything but Islam is irresponsible. I couldn't lose sight of the confusing and terrifying purpose of life, and because I spent so much time routinely reading and memorizing Quran, I had less time, energy, or interest left to read anything else. Now that's no way for a 14-year-old to live, but there I was, burdened with existential dread, and I felt responsible for my inquisitive nature, and I grew to dislike that side of me. I envied those who didn't know what they're missing because they didn't ask as many questions as me. I also thought that I was the only one who didn't get it. Many verses in the Quran repeat the question, do they not think? Do they not ponder? I did think and ponder, but apparently not the right way. So I believed that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Which leads me to the second way Islam hurt my mental health. I did not trust myself. It seemed to me like everyone else either understood Islam better than I did, or had less difficulty in accepting its dead ends. Even those who did worse in school seemed to be ahead of me in that department. I was always academically distinguished, yet because of Islam, I felt like the most lost person in the room. I felt like I cannot trust myself if I'm often in disagreement with the crowds around me. Because remember, Islam was a fact of life. I didn't even entertain the possibility that Islam is false and that my critical thoughts were valid. I got used to the habit of dismissing those thoughts in favor of religious answers, even if I wasn't completely convinced. I got used to hearing the sentence, there are things beyond your comprehension, and I eventually took it to heart. I accepted that most things in life are beyond my comprehension, because Islam was a big part of my life. So this attitude carried over to life beyond religion. I sometimes gave up on new things because I accepted that they too are probably beyond my comprehension. Now, a healthier way to reframe it is that there are a lot of mysteries in the world, and instead of being anxious about how much I don't know, I could be excited about how much I can learn. And if there's one unanswerable question, that's okay. There are plenty more answerable questions to pursue. Without the threats and without the urgency, I would have been more okay with letting Islam's flaws remain unanswerable. But that's the trap. The ticking time bomb that is the Day of Judgment is what periodically threw me back into questioning. For a long time, I struggled to believe in myself. I always felt like an imposter because I was always in denial about my skepticism. I was a believing Muslim despite my best judgment, so I couldn't trust my best judgment. Sheikhs even explicitly instruct you to question yourself before you question Allah. And I questioned myself a lot, so I got used to feeling like an imposter around Muslims. Then I carried that feeling over to other parts of my life. But I know that I'm not an imposter. I faced my indoctrination and my most deep-seated fears to be where I am today. And rather than focusing on how sad it is that millions of people are going through the same thing all on their own, I'm trying to do something about it. So if you feel the way I did, like an imposter of a believer, then try to give yourself a break. That might be your religious guilt speaking. You don't have to feel bad about not believing what everyone else believes. And it is tempting to think of every believer as a deceptive liar who played a part in making me distrust myself. But I know that's not productive or true. They weren't trying to lie as much as they were unknowingly sharing false information. But whether intentionally or not, religion can cause real harm. Which brings me to the third way Islam harmed my mental health. I was always ashamed and guilty. A friend once told me that I'd make an excellent Catholic because of the amount of guilt that I carry. Thank you, I guess. I don't really know how to structure this section because it's an all-you-can-eat buffet of guilt and shame and self-blame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to list a bunch of these sources of negative emotions in no particular order, and every now and then I'll mention a rebuttal that I needed to hear back when I was a believer. As a Muslim, I felt guilty for being too inquisitive and unsatisfied with religious explanations. I felt guilty for not being able to strengthen my faith through worship or prayer or learning. I needed to hear that it's okay to be inquisitive and suspicious of religious stories, and that it is unreasonable to use faith as a substitute for clarity. I felt guilty when I didn't want to pray, because it was repetitive, boring, and a stressful reminder of my cognitive dissonance. In a similar vein, any mention of religion increased my stress, which made me feel guilty. Why is Islam stressing me out? Is it because I'm a bad person, or because the shaitan is in my head? I needed to hear that it's okay to not want to pray, and that a supposedly perfect God wouldn't be so demanding and petty to punish me for my feelings or punish me if I skip prayer altogether. And it's okay to be stressed by religion. It's difficult to reconcile mythology with reality, especially when the threat of hell is hanging over my head. I felt guilty when I forgot to pray, or when I failed to focus on prayer. Perhaps the devil was overpowering me, or urinating in my ear, or some other outrageous religious explanation. I wish I knew that it's okay to lose focus on something I am not interested in. That is not a moral failure. I felt guilty when I compared myself to prophets or the companions. I was told that they believed so strongly and sacrificed so much for Islam, yet here I was, unable to completely have faith. I wish I knew that comparisons with others can be unhealthy, especially when the others are idealized and possibly fictional characters. I also felt shameful and guilty for my harmful relationship with sex. I won't get into that here because I spoke about that topic in another video, so consider watching it next. I felt ashamed of myself when I couldn't use religion to fight my compulsivity. For example, when I was under a lot of stress, I had a habit of biting my nails. It's an undesirable habit in general, but especially during Ramadan, when it could count as breaking my fast. And no amount of praying or shame of Allah watching me helped me deal with that problem. Which brings us to the fourth way Islam harmed my mental health. It turned me into an overthinker. Imagine having an overbearing authority figure, say a parent, looking over your shoulder 24/7. For every thought that you have and every decision you make, you glance back and notice them staring directly into your eyes. They don't say a word, and they don't need to. Their stare burns a hole in the back of your head. You can feel them observing you intently and judging you. Now imagine if that parent had anger issues and was capable of torturing you in heinous ways. Wouldn't you be uncomfortable with their constant presence? That is how I felt about God and his snitchy angels. It's not enough for God to know your every thought, but he also employs a pair of angels to record everything that you do. Even your own body parts will testify against you on the day of judgment. That all made me feel perceived all the time without the right to privacy, not even in my own head. To try to get ahead of this, I developed a habit of questioning my own thoughts as if I have to explain them to someone else, as if I'll be dragged in front of God and humanity naked, both literally and metaphorically, in order to justify my thoughts. While a bit of self-reflection is healthy and necessary for growth, this kind of excessive scrutiny can be very damaging. And it baffles me how most Muslims don't seem too aware or too bothered by this. Or at least I haven't heard them talking about it openly. I'm sure I'm not the only one to feel this way, but how can a believer question God's self-given right to spy on us? Though I no longer believe that God is watching me, I still struggle with overthinking. I still have an irrational fear of being summoned in front of the world for all my thoughts and actions to be dissected meticulously. And because I have no reason to believe that there's a keeper of justice up in the sky, I feel hyper-responsible for my own morality. And that's something I still haven't fully resolved. For as long as I can remember, I prayed and begged and cried for Allah to make it all make sense, but that never worked. And I wondered why Allah was missing now, when he was on call for Muhammad's prophethood, like when he conveniently revealed verses to coerce his wives. But Allah didn't bother to answer my questions, and he didn't bother to make Islam self-evident and indisputable. So with Allah as silent as Zeus and Odin and all the other God characters, I struggled alone because I didn't feel comfortable discussing this stuff with anyone aside from the occasional sheikh. And whenever I sinned or neglected my prayers, I blamed myself and assumed that my slacking caused my faith crisis. Often when apostates talk about mental health or religious trauma, believers pounce on the opportunity to say, "Aha, so that's why you left Islam." Well, in my case at least, no. All these struggles are because I didn't know I could leave Islam sooner. Had someone explained to me that Islam is not a fact, but merely one of many hypotheses about God, I might have not suffered so much. I suffered because of belief and because of not leaving it behind. A similar accusation is, you left Islam for emotional reasons, to which I'd say, no, I stayed for emotional reasons. I eventually left because I realized Islam has no real claim to the truth. In fact, ironically, it manipulates a believer's emotions rather than presenting evidence. Why is the Quran full of threats instead of being full of evidence? Besides, believers don't object to emotion when it's in favor of religion. A preacher or a convert can cry and gesticulate about their feelings and their beliefs, and they're celebrated instead of being dismissed. So when it comes to accusations of emotional reasoning, it's projection. It's the pot calling the kettle black. Either way, humans are not purely rational. We're also pretty emotional, so it's unfair to demand robotic rationality when leaving religion while using guilt and fear and love to keep people in religion. So don't let that kind of dismissive rhetoric discourage you. Your struggles with religion are valid, and you shouldn't be expected to endure them for the sake of an unprovable story. Now, I understand that my experience is not every believer's experience, but I bet it's not that uncommon either. It's just uncommonly talked about. And that's step one towards healing, admitting to ourselves and each other that religion isn't all perfect and rosy. Despite how much religion and its followers might weaponize my struggles against me, I have no shame in talking about them, because someone has to break the cycle eventually. And I recognize how difficult it can be to get help from a mental health professional. Aside from cost and availability, they're not always equipped to deal with issues related to religion, especially Islam. And I hope to change that someday. But in the meantime, I encourage you to still seek that kind of help if you can, and supplement it with learning from those who deconstructed from religion, like myself and many others on YouTube and elsewhere. I also highly recommend that you check out this channel called Theremin Trees. It was really helpful during my deconstruction, and I might not have made it this far without it. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me today. There's a lot more I could talk about with regards to Islam and my mental health, so if you'd like to hear more, hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments below. And share your own thoughts and experiences as well. And before you go, hit the like button so this video reaches the audience that needs it. A special thank you to my patrons, YouTube members, and donors for supporting this channel. I could not do this without you. And if you would like to join our Discord server where you get to discuss these topics yourself, check out the links in the description below. I hope to see you there. And as always, think critically and think for yourself. And consider watching one of these videos next.